US President Biden, who's been besieged by many crises, particularly Ukraine, would have at least found a moment of relief so he could declare victory about one thing. And this victory came from a territory which should be familiar to the Americans across the political spectrum in that country. Because this is the territory where ISIS had struck roots. ISIS, the Islamic State, had also established territorial control, and they had also established something that they described as a caliphate. This is taking parts of the territory from Syria, Iraq, mostly Syria and Iraq, maybe a sliver from Turkey here and there, but mostly from Syria and Iraq. That then was taken away when the Allied forces were, curiously, even the Iranians fought ISIS. ISIS lost control of Mosul, the big town, the big city they control, and that's where in September 2019, President Trump had announced quite triumphantly that his forces had been killed. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was then the reigning chief of ISIS. So now Joe Biden has announced that his forces have been able to kill, in fact, the expression he used in his tweet was removed from battlefield or taken out of the battlefield, right? That's a new expression. And I find these curious because if you look at the Indian discourse, Indian armed forces, for example, for a terrorist, almost would never say killed such and such terrorist. They will say neutralized. I don't know how neutralized is any better or worse. Is it more euphemistical? Or maybe it is just sort of armed forces speak for killed, for bad guys. Now, in this case, he has said removed from battlefield. Now, what's happened in this case is that US Special Forces, this was an operation not dissimilar to what happened with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. US forces carried by helicopters surrounded this compound or this big house in a place in northwestern Syria, called Athme in Idlib province. If you see the map of the Middle East and map of Syria and we zero in on that, you will see where it is. So that is where they reached. Obviously, they had information that he was there because after all, no matter how well you hide, at some point you will use some communication. And when you use some communication electronically, there is every chance that somebody will catch it. But also, by this time, all sides run informers. And even the US, Iraqis, Syrians, everybody has informers also in ISIS. So somebody gave away his position. His position or his compound was surrounded by US Special Forces. He was asked to surrender. And once again, the same kind of scene that was enacted when Abu al-Baghdadi was removed from battlefield or removed himself for battlefield. The same thing happened here. An explosion took place in the compound, in the building. The top half of the building was blown off. Looks like that's where the current chief of ISIS, until he got blown up just about little over 24 hours back, that is where he was living with his wives, at least 3 of them, and a bunch of children. So from the rubble of the building, the forces found 13 bodies. There was also a video in which one young girl, maybe 5 or 6-year-old, was seen being taken away by some rescuers. She had blood on her face, she was crying, and she was saying, "They've killed my mom and dad." Now it's presumed that she was one of the children of the ISIS chief who died, but we can't be very sure. Now, who was this man? Abdul Qardash, alias also known as Haji Abdullah, also known as Abu Zarabi al-Hashimi al-Qureshi, but actually named Amir Muhammad Said al-Salbi al-Maula. Now, he was born in a village called Mahallabia, which is 20 kilometers west of Mosul. Mosul, as I told you, is an important landmark. It's also something that our minds find easy to identify or think about. But you can see the map of that region and see where Mosul is. And I presume many of you have seen documentaries, movies about Mosul because it became such a big story and such a mishmash of forces where nobody quite knew for some time who was fighting who. And when all that double crossing and all that mess was over, At the end of it, Mosul was liberated from ISIS. It's now been restored beautifully. It's quite an inspirational story. But also, ISIS had lost its claims to a physical caliphate. Now, Qardash himself was one of the 16 children, 7 sons and 9 daughters of an imam of the mosque in this village, Malhabia, close to Mosul. Now, by the time Donald Trump said that his forces had taken out Baghdadi, ISIS was already a pale shadow of what it used to be. But Baghdadi was a big name, symbolic, he was a big fighter, he was also a very violent man. So his departure, some people would have thought that that will change things and now ISIS will completely lose its identity. But that did not happen because, first of all, bad guys are very good at succession planning. Sometimes the good guys are not so good because they think that just as I became the boss, someone else will also become the boss. And in any case, what will happen even after I go away? Plus, good guys also seem to think that I can go on forever. The bad guys, and that is just my guesswork, the bad guys probably think that look, my lifespan is limited, particularly since the day I become famous. There'll be some drone, something, some bomb, some assassin who will have my name written someplace, and my life is limited. So let me do succession planning, particularly if they have an ideological commitment. So Baghdadi had already been training and mentoring Qardash to be his successor, and he took over sort of seamlessly. Just as he was killed, it didn't look like ISIS was leaderless even for more than a couple of weeks, and Qardash took over. Now, who was Qardash? So first of all, I will tell you that he was not a fighter. He carried a weapon, but he's not somebody who had gone on any front lines to fight for ISIS. That is unlike most of the top ISIS leadership. You might then think that, oh, maybe he was a politician, so may not have been as bad or as cruel as Baghdadi. Actually, he was much worse than Baghdadi. And what was he? He was a judge. He was a jurist on Quranic law as he saw it. And in that profession or in that role, he risen to a level where he was the de facto justice minister of this caliphate, quote unquote, government. And he made his fame when ISIS overran the town of Sinjar. Sinjar is a town which had a large Yazidi population. Thousands and thousands of Yazidis were slaughtered there and taken slave, particularly a lot of Yazidi women. And that story still sort of festers even now. Now, after that, it seems, and this is what I read in a lot of the literature that's available on this issue, there was a big debate within the ISIS ranks on whether to take captured women as slaves or not. So there was one school which was seen to be the school of the Syrian ISIS members, who said that old tradition is that women of a defeated population, you should take them as your slaves. It is fine. Those from the Iraqi side, on the other hand, did not want to agree with this. They said, let the women go, at least don't take them as slaves. Now, it's possible that their motivation was not sort of a relatively liberal or anything. It was mainly because they might have thought that today it's the women of the Yazidis. Tomorrow, if we are defeated, somebody will take or some other group will take our women slaves. But whatever it is, this debate then got widened into what to do with other non-Muslim women, for example, Christian women. And in this debate, Qardash was very strongly in favor of taking everybody into slavery, because he said that is what the traditional old interpretation, the original interpretation of the Quranic laws teaches us. There was a debate of sorts, after which it was decided that Christian women will not be taken slaves, but Yazidi women would be taken into slavery. That was seen as a big ideological victory for Qardash, because he'd been able to prevail upon everybody by quoting the scriptures. He was not particularly a nice guy. In fact, we should be happy to be talking about him in the past tense. So he's the one who's gone, and looks like he's gone exactly the same way that his predecessor had gone, that is blowing himself up along with his family and maybe some key aides, rather than surrender to US forces. The other little difference between this raid and the last one is that in this one, the US forces lost a helicopter just as they had lost one in the Osama bin Laden raid, to technical reasons, after which they say they carried out a controlled destruction of their Apache helicopter. Otherwise, the forces did not suffer any casualties. Now, Qardash himself has a very interesting history. Qardash was actually sort of a low-level worker, and it's quite well known that at various points of time, he was also an informer of the US forces. In fact, as an informer, he even had a number. It's M060108-01, whatever that means. That was a code name or number that they had given to him. But he was obviously more loyal to Al-Qaeda. He's from the original Al-Qaeda group, as everybody in ISIS was. I will tell you in a minute what exactly happened. How did Al-Qaeda or remnants of Al-Qaeda transformed into ISIS in Iraq. He was also an educated person, a graduate with honors in Quranic studies. In 2008, his home was raided by the American and Iraqi forces. He was arrested and he was taken to a place called Camp Bukka. Camp Bukka was one of the prison camps that the US forces were running in Iraq. Camp Bukka was named so after the New York Fire Department Marshal Ronald Bukka, who had died during the 9/11 rescue operation. So there this man was kept. His prisoner number was 326175. But you know what happened? After that, there was a status of forces agreement that the Iraqi government and the US government signed, after which the Americans began withdrawals and they dismantled this jail, and a lot of people escaped or they were released, including Qardash himself. And then he rose through the ranks, and his family saw violence also. One of his brothers, Amir al-Mawla, was assassinated. We don't know by who. The other brother, Adil, he went away to Turkey. He, on the other hand, Qardash on the other hand, then became a kind of enforcer of the toughest version or interpretation of the Islamic law on those that ISIS saw as traitors to their cause. So the doctrines he invoked often enough was fitna, which is kind of sedition or treason, you might call it in a traditional way, and khawarij, which is renegade. So anybody who's against us, any Muslim who's against us, is a khawarij or a renegade. Also, it was under his watch, while Baghdadi was still around, that ISIS divided itself in small subunits all over the region instead of being centralized in one place, because that would make them very vulnerable again. And they then set up little networks that will be in touch with each other. These little units in the network were called rabtas. Rabta is an expression we used in Urdu or Hindustani in India very often. आपका उनके साथ राब्ता है कि आपकी उनके साथ जान पहचान है. So rabta was like connections. We get a lot of this information from an article which I am sharing with you from New Lines, which is a website by a BBC writer, Feras Kilani, who is a specialist on the region. Now, this has come at a time when, in fact, ISIS has shown us the ability of being able to strike some key places. So, ISIS struck not long ago an Iraqi forces camp not far from Baghdad and killed 11 Iraqi soldiers. Then just a few days back, on 22nd, 23rd January, they also struck a big prison. This big prison is not in such a distant part of Syria. This is the big prison called Guayran in the northeastern city of Hasakeh. This prison was being guarded by Syrian Democratic Forces. Syrian Democratic Forces is another name for Kurdish forces. So for a moment, ISIS took over the prison. A lot of people ran away, or they were released from there, or they were allowed to flee. STF, on the other hand, now claims that they were able to control the situation back, and more than 100 of those who escaped have been captured. But nobody knows quite how many had actually escaped. So ISIS lately has been showing that it's able to strike, but a bit like a guerrilla group now, not like a group definitely which has any territory or which can run a semblance of a government. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about how did Al-Qaeda became ISIS. And we've spoken about this. So in the last days of Osama bin Laden, as he was becoming more and more ineffectual, the leader of his group in the Middle East, in Iraq, in fact, at that point, was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And there are records of, in fact, Osama bin Laden writing desperate letters to Zarqawi saying, listen to me, do this, don't do this. But Zarqawi wasn't listening to him. So Zarqawi was building Al-Qaeda in his own image. So when Osama died, Zarqawi took over sort of seamlessly in the Middle East. Now, as he took over in the Middle East, he also became a target. So ultimately, in June 7, 2006, US forces found him in a safe house sort of north of Baghdad, bombed it in an air attack and killed him. So he died there. As he died, whatever was left of Al-Qaeda also sort of got vaporized. And that then people from Al-Qaeda then slowly became ISIS. For some time, Al-Qaeda and ISIS fought each other. Even the area that Qardash comes from, even there for some time, there was a fight between followers of Al-Qaeda and the new adherents of ISIS. So in that area, an organization came up called Jabhat al-Nusra, which was an Al-Qaeda affiliate. But in the course of time, it broke away from Al-Qaeda. It changed many names. And finally, it's on the side of ISIS fighting Al-Qaeda affiliates. Now, what this tells us is that these are amorphous organizations now. What is ISIS? How does ISIS come up anywhere, although its leaders keep on getting killed? That is because ISIS has now become a loose franchise. It's a franchise, anybody can do something awful in its name, right? And become a kind of hero in that little folklore. That is precisely what happened with those terrorists who blew up the hotels in Sri Lanka at Easter time, because they just took inspiration from ISIS. What ISIS franchises to you is not necessarily equipment, explosives, weapons, training. It franchises ideology to you and also gives you legitimacy, gives you religious legitimacy for the awful things that you are going to do. That's why it now almost looks like impossible to destroy ISIS completely, to stamp it out completely, because it does not have a central leadership which you can either wipe out or you can negotiate with. Because even if you did both, you wiped out a leadership and the next leadership you negotiated with, ideology will still remain and there will still be people doing stuff in its same. But you know what? At the same time, one more really bad guy not being there is good news. It's better to not have him around, or for him to have been lifted or taken away from the battlefield, as Joe Biden put it, rather than have him still there. We know that soon enough there'll be another guy. Maybe he'll be even worse than this one, but we also know that he will not have very long to live.